Still nothing, Alexa, if you're saying anything.
I saw him briefly. He's not muted.
We're going to use the HackMD that you made a PR for, Amy.
Say that again.
There's a PR that Amy had opened for the HackMD.
Oh.
For March 2nd.
I have no memory of this. Let me look. It's definitely like, oh God, I think I was a person then.
Yeah, March 2nd. A long time ago.
Oh, yeah. No, I know what you're talking about.
Paste the HackMD link here in the chat.
Yeah,
somebody's already done it.
Yeah,
same thing. Everybody all at once.
Let's all do it.
Yes. Faster.
So let's see. Steve, Sam, Vincent, Waifu, Alexa. Yeah, so we have the 6 that I thought we'd have. So I assume.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yep, that's working.
Something tells me that Alexa is dealing with Linux and audio systems.
Which is very well known to be a system that works perfectly without any issues. Yeah, so I didn't hear from Michael, John, or Derek, but we're being recorded, so we will let those folks catch up.
Michael who?
Crosby.
Oh.
Yeah, he's still TOB through next January.
I'm looking at the attendees of who actually did attend last time.
Yeah. So I don't know what everyone else's day was like. I had a tab open all day with the HackMD from last time. I briefly read over the categorizing project types, but maybe I'll take 60 seconds to kind of revisit how we ended the last call, since it's been a month and 3 days, 4 days. So the intent that we ended up with at the end of the last call was, before we jump into debating or deciding or figuring out auras, Yumochi, are these good, are they bad, indifferent, let's actually think about, and again, last call we spent a little bit on some history of the OCI. Why would we take on a software library or tool? And if so, can we think about it in terms of a set of buckets, if you will, of different types of projects that make sense in the OCI versus sending someone off to CNCF or sending them to, what did CNAB went to that other, the Apache JSF?
Yeah, the JF.
Yeah. So, there are other options. I don't think we should feel pressure that this is the last, possible spot for these projects, but instead, I think our goal was, let's think about some buckets and then try, I think Steve had a good idea, with these definitions, look at what we already have, and decide, is that a good set of is that the right scope for how we decide what fits in the OCI? Anyone else want to add anything to catches us up? Oh, and Derek's here.
Yeah, when I was thinking over it, I mean, I'm still actually looking at the notes that y'all had from last time, but when I had looked at those PRs, again, I'm not terribly for or against either one of them. I almost wish that we just had a criteria that we could, almost like a ruler, to say, you know, is it a reference implementation? Is it accomplish the things that, you know, the things that we need for the project, or like libraries or otherwise? Like, I wish we just had like a set of criteria, be like, it doesn't make sense, it does make sense. I think that's the kind of gray area that is up for debate on these projects.
I mean,
Yeah.
especially since the scope table in theory was meant to solve that problem, but it sort of hasn't, in that whenever we needed something new that wasn't in the scope table, we just modified the scope table, sort of invalidating it as a set of requirements.
Yeah,
Right.
In that, yeah. Yeah, I think, and especially given the whole CNCF OCI relationship, it's a little bit, yeah, we're in a bit of a weird place where it feels like a lot of projects would make more sense in CNCF than OCI. But on the other hand, I mean, it wouldn't make sense, at least I think, that reference implementations, it doesn't really make much sense to put them in CNCF, because they sort of accomplish something different to what the CNCF is going for. At least that's my view.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's kind of in line with what we were thinking about last time, and I think even Run C is like a little unique because it's both a reference implementation, but it became the thing that like every higher level component relies on, and you know, so you have all kinds of distros and Kubernetes releases like packaging Run C and building it, you know, in their own project. So in a sense, it's like a open source product, but yet, you know, it's fairly low level, and at least as an open source project, we don't drive like the release cycles for like Docker or Creo or VMware's Kubernetes distribution or whatever. So, you know, Run C is like hard to even figure out what, like if it appeared on the scene today, I don't know where it would have ended up, but again, I think we just kind of take that as a unique point in time, like where things were in 2015. And then last time we talked a little, you know, we have Go Digest and the seccomp binding, which are extremely simple helper, almost like little helper functions. And I think, you know, we brought up that that's, you know, they're not like, you know, things with a UX that has to be expanded and developed over time. Like no one's actually asking for new releases or new features. So I feel like that's kind of where, at least today, where we are on libraries, is we've accepted a few very small helper collections of functions, so to speak, just to make it simpler for people to have a starting point.
How do we write that up to kind of like be that the lines on the ruler?
Yeah, I think that's where it's hard to have an exceptionally specific scope, because, you know, there's all kinds of pitfalls there. Are we talking, okay, it's 100 lines of code, or it's 5 functions, or it doesn't have a UX? I mean, maybe there's some combination of those things that makes sense to describe. Anyone else have thoughts on that? On the, I mean, because that's where I could kind of see Oros fitting, just because the, you know, a couple hundred lines of code to push some JSON and a manifest is kind of what Oros, you know, I spent a little time poking at it recently. But yet, you know, it also has a little client that helps you, you know, try it out. So yeah, that's where I have a hard time figuring out, you know, what's the right line.
One of the things that was interesting we discussed last time was like CNCF has its own promotion, its own ability for, it's intended for lots of people to collaborate on, and it's got marketing efforts around it and others. Whereas I look at, there's a couple of things that are just tooling around the OCI specs that enable them. Because, like, I don't anticipate ORAS, or I'm assuming Emochi as well, and some of these others to have any kind of promotion or big project kind of marketing efforts around them, because they're really just enabling libraries and tools for, distribution and image spec. And I'm trying to figure out how to correlate that, because I think that's what's helpful. Like the ORAS library was built to enable different artifact stores, so they don't have to deal with implementation of that registry push and pull stuff. And just like I assume run C is used by a lot of different tools, so like that's where we expect ORAS to be. Like that's how it helps with Helm, in Singularity and OPA and a couple of others. But I'm trying not to use those as like justification. I'm trying to figure out how do we articulate that so that when we look at these, it's like, oh yeah, that lines up on the ruler this way. Not necessarily for size, but like you can measure something and say that it meets these requirements really easily, so it's clear which falls. Somebody that's trying to get a lot of promotion for something like that, well, they should go over to CNCF, because we're not going to do any of that stuff in OCI. It's just not the scope of what this board does.
I mean, I completely agree, and in fact, I would even say that I don't think RunC is an outlier, Phil. I think that while it has become a much more widely used project than maybe was expected initially, it does fit the ruler, quote unquote, of it's a tool you can use as a component in an actual product. Like I don't think you could sell RunC as a product, for instance. Even though it's a very essential tool for a lot of things that are built on top of containers, it's not something that is innovative. I mean, I'm just going to repeat what Steve basically said. I agree. I think that if we had a ruler which was like that, because I mean, I've always considered OCI to be more about low-level tooling that then can be used to build something else, while CNCF I've always seen as more being about like full products, like obviously Kubernetes, but also like Rook and pick your CNCF project. They all basically have. It's more like a product that you can ready-made use rather than a tool for building.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think that maybe some combination of those thoughts effectively. I think our scope should be clear that any project that's expecting some kind of, well, I don't know how to summarize easily the sort of CNCF benefits, I guess you could say, project benefits. Effectively, we're not offering that for OCI projects. Instead, it's along the lines of what Alexa was just saying, that these are building blocks, both the specs and potentially some small libraries and reference implementations that then can be used to build a project that may turn into something that gets productized or expanded on in the CNCF in some higher layer. I mean, that kind of seems, does that seem like kind of what we're heading toward?
I think so. I mean, that kind of feels like some of the criteria. I think both Emochi and ORAS had started to have their own brand, but they don't strike me as a project that would be full on down that way otherwise, other than just initially establishing themselves. In fact, that if we were to try and, what's the rule? What's the term that I'm looking for? Not heuristics. If we're trying to come up with like the rule of thumb of projects do they implement something as a reference? Are they generally usable or reusable, like commonly reusable? Almost like how Run C, you don't have to use it, but it's commonly reusable, but it is the implementation. Other people obviously are pushing and pulling JSONs, but you could use that ORAS tool. Folks are obviously unpacking and repacking, but you know, Emoji would do it as common and even be as a library. So it's like not looking for marketing and branding. These are the kind of the questions of like, does it line up? And then also, I think part of the conversation, part of that question block to like do a validation, scorecard validation would be, are we already doing, do we already have something in that space, you know? And that's where for some of these, like the OCI image tool is already in there. Arguably has overlap with Emoji, but as we discussed before, perhaps it's fine if we, part of the conversation is we have something here, but it's a dead and broken project. Time to life cycle it. And that was, so if people are just proposing things, then, you know, we're not just going to accept everything. There has to be a discussion, but these are some of the criteria of like being able to say no to something earlier than later is what was my point initially. And so far these neither one of these are easy to say no to earlier than later.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that we shouldn't have like 3 copies of Run C or 3 different versions of Run C in OCI. And yeah, this is definitely one of the things that we should take into consideration when we look at new projects or look at projects for inclusion.
Yeah, I guess along those lines, I think the other aspect we haven't talked about so far that we spent a little time on last call is, you know, just again, this is my point of view, but I'm curious if others agree. The OCI doesn't necessarily have a lot of draw from a broad developer community. So if you think about, you know, I don't know, let's Sysdig Falco, like eBPF, debugging, like this is a popular topic. You put it in the CNCF, all of a sudden, you know, thousands of developers hear about it, and maybe they want to get involved, maybe they want to contribute, become a maintainer. I don't feel like we have that same draw in the OCI. I mean, we have a great group of folks showing up to the calls, with registry, notary work, and spec. You know, it seems like we have a strong group of players from that community. But when I think about adding a project, the other thing I have to consider is, are we expecting that by being part of the OCI, or like for Emoji, I think Alexa, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, it's a project you've mostly done yourself and you'd love to have other people involved, but I'm not sure the OCI is the place where we're going to get a bunch of new people saying, oh, that's cool, I'll go check that out and maybe I'll become a contributor. It doesn't seem like we have that draw in the OCI. So that's one aspect. I'm not sure we can really help projects build community just by nature of being in the OCI.
I mean, I agree that is one drawback at the moment of OCI, and I think that I mean, yeah, we definitely have lackluster marketing in that people I don't think really pay much attention to what we're working on, at least outside of Run C, I think, for the moment. And so I guess also, yeah, but I don't think that. Yeah, I mean, I think if the sole reason why a project wants to join OCI is because of is in the hopes that it will get more people interested. I think that that's not a good enough reason by itself. But I think if the project has effectively other reasons that make sense, then it shouldn't discount them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I broadly agree that it's not like having the project under the GitHub organization suddenly means you get like 5 times more PRs. That isn't how it works generally.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I think kind of going back, I mean, I think you're probably talking about is how many people are in support or maintaining it, and that's a different aspect. But I guess I kind of think of the things that we're putting in the OCI stuff, that at least we're talking about, are not things that we're trying to self-promote for themselves. It's more, they're there to enable the projects that are in OCI. Like, we did Aura not because it was trying to be something else. It was, hey, we're trying to get this artifact thing done. And here's the whole idea of the artifact stuff is I shouldn't have to know the implementation details of a registry. Like, I want to focus on my thing. I want to build my thing, and I need a place to store the thing. Give me a library that I can use that distribution thing you've given me, but I don't want to think about it. And I guess the same thing for Mochi if that serves that goal. They're not trying to be things. They're not trying to be like a Prometheus or something that stands on itself. They're really just enablers.
Yeah. 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 My point is more general, that as we're trying to think about, I mean, it almost seems like we're creating a list of the don'ts. Don't bring your project OCI if you're expecting CNCF-like branding or promotion. Don't bring your project to OCI if you're expecting to gain, contributions or attract, project community. But yeah, I'm not meaning to overlap that with that's the expectation of either of the two proposals we have, necessarily. Just more thinking through that. And again, for these two proposals, I think, I don't think I'm worried about this in the short term for either of them, but just thinking about, again, that statement about the sort of scope and size of the interested parties of the OCI. I think about year 2, year 3, year 4 down the road that, we have potentially 2, 3, 4 more projects for which key people have changed jobs, changed interest, changed direction. And now the OCI is left with, do we archive this? People are now depending on it. How do we gracefully, transition it? So that's something, the CNCF has had to develop actual processes for. And I feel like if we both have to develop this kind of clear scope of how we add, but then once we add, we actually have to develop a set of processes. But, and I'm not talking about these are extremely hard things, but I think we can't ignore that those things do happen. And so we have to be prepared for, that potential down the road.
No, long-term maintenance is always an issue. So where do the problems happen there? Are there issues that there's a source code just sitting there and there's not a lot of use and there's no maintenance and we don't know how to deprecate? Or is it there's lots of use, issues surface, but all the maintainers have moved on? And then there's the assumption is the sanctioning body is supposed to be maintaining it. Like, what exactly are the problems that happen in the past?
Yeah, so
I think we have both of those. So even literally as I'm sitting here thinking about it, it reminded me that there's been a need for a Go Digest release. And before we got the release out, we needed to update the copyright because that was like a contingency for some people. So we at this point actually have people from the community. I think it's even like a Debian packager or somebody who's wanting to get this out and update the copyright. And the PR for that has been sitting out there for months now. And I could tag a release, but I can't even get 2 maintainers to LGTM that thing to get it released so that the Debian packagers can have a pinned version with the proper copyright. That's one side of it. It's like, it's fine. It's mostly code complete, but it's just like maintenance stuff.
I thought that one was an actual like problem with that pull approved thing. We can't physically merge it. I thought we had two LGTMs.
Oh, that's true. We do have two LGTMs and a ping Initech. So then I have another PR for the pull approved to fix that, and nobody's approved that. Anyhow, it's like we've pinged people for help, but it's just kind of like stalled. So that's like one side of it. The other side is the best of what, I mean, I don't know. I feel kind of ashamed for how the project went, but with the OCI image tool, is that it was like there was a need for a tool to do these kind of image manipulation things and to use the library, either be the library and or use the structs that were in the image spec. And a lot of the maintainers that were on that were not, it ended up becoming a diverging between two different sets of maintainers, because it ended up being almost a language barrier, but also community differences. And it diverged in what needed to be done, being able to communicate back what needed to be done in the specs. And so eventually that project just felt kind of starved because it was needing features and couldn't communicate it back easily or well. I don't really know what. I'm literally not pointing fingers except for maybe myself that I wasn't able to bridge those two together well enough. So effectively the tool never fully did what it was set out to do before all the maintainers moved on. And so now it's a partially usable tool with no active maintainers. And it's not had any activity as far as I can tell in a while. And so the project is effectively a husk of what it had hoped to be and is not anything anybody would jump on and use. So
that sounds like a good archive candidate, as opposed to there's needs on something and there's no active maintainers. But if there was needs on something, the theory is it's open source, and if somebody wants to make a PR and if there's no maintainers around, if that person that's making the PR is that interested, could they be promoted as a maintainer? I'm more trying to flesh out like what are the problems that are unsolvable, you just archive it, versus the ones that become self-solvable because the whole point of open source is the constant community churn of people that are interested in help.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So Steve, I think you're right. I mean, it's not that these aren't solvable problems. One aspect is just like reputation of the, if you end up with a project that lacks maintenance or lacks, just good hygiene, a security issue comes up and all of a sudden it's like, oh, no one's really looking at that, yet there's XYZ company, turns out they're depending on it. So, security issues are a concern in that environment. You're right, if it really goes to a point where no one's using it, then a simple process for retiring it usually is sufficient, or finding an interested party. But I guess my point in all of that is that there are limited resources in the OCI. So if you think about, one or two projects, that's probably not that big a deal. But if that continued and now there's 6, 7, 8, 9 discrete projects, and the TOB has to figure out, what to do with various projects, then it becomes an added burden, and also reflects on, again, that to me, there's kind of a reputation aspect. If you take on a project, then you essentially have responsibility, long-term for that project.
Yeah, we shouldn't take on projects that just go to die, is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah. And again, all those things are solvable. To me, it's more the scope of, what's the CNCF TOC? It's up to 13 members, and they have the governing board above that. I mean, there's a lot more hands on deck, I guess, so to speak, to deal with those issues. And I think in the OCI, because we're a smaller community, it behooves us to be a little more cautious about the potential workload of just simply adding projects. Yeah, so it's not a make or break for these proposals. It's more, as I think through all the things about why the OCI is the scope it is today, these are kind of the topics that come to mind.
Yeah, and I think we're still in the category of what should be in the queue, and these are just, then we could talk about how these two match, but I think you're generally saying is we want to make sure that there's some longevity to it, there's some support. We don't have a lot of infrastructure in OCI, so the tax has to be low. And we want to cultivate a set of things that we expect to be active, not just, this is cool, throw it in there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and again, that's where there has to be a line somewhere, because CNCF is paying for security audits, they're paying for website development, they're paying for some of the promotional and marketing activities. And again, we've already discussed some of that, but to me, that's just part and parcel of how we scope the statement, such that we make sure that the projects we're bringing in just don't have those kind of burdens that all of a sudden someone doesn't say, oh, I wish ORAS had a cool website where I could go, have a bunch of documentation on how to use it. Again, unless the maintainers themselves, the project maintainers, want to do that, that's not like a service offered by the OCI.
Well, I will come and step in here simply because, I think that some of the things that we're talking about are actually totally possible, as far as being able to set up, look, we just need some GitHub repos, powered by Netlify, and we can put stuff together in here. But I think being able to set the expectation of there is lightweight things that we can do here. There's lightweight things that we're available for, but not the big heavy marketing engine. And I feel like we're getting stuck on the rabbit hole of it, we provide nothing or we provide everything. And that's not entirely true.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, the OCI has a budget. We have, so it's not an all or nothing proposition. That's a good reminder.
And it's very iterative. We can come and change things as people need to, as far as when it becomes deeply apparent that there is a need. In frankly, some of the ways that VBATS was talking about hey, we had a project, there was a need and no one saw it until it was way too late. And Vincent, you could nod quietly if I'm speaking the truth and I've articulated what you've said. Being able to articulate that actually is something that we can look towards being able to resolve in the future by being a little bit more structured about what our mission is.
Yeah. So in the interest of, I guess my worry here is I'm saying a lot of words, and I'm throwing a few notes on the HackMD in case anyone else wants to poke at that. But because I personally feel wishy-washy about a few of these things, I feel like we could kind of circle this forever. I mean, do we feel like the next step is actually taking the partial notes that Steve put together last time? They're still at the bottom of this HackMD, and just making an explicit list? And then I guess the problem,
there's to me, a lot of this, you're right. We could circle this forever, and I don't want to. I don't have time for that. And the other part is that, to me, some of this kind of has contingencies of, it's a separate line item, but how can it's up to the TOB to move to archive a project. to me, that's one of the few things that's holding back me just being like, yeah, for sure. Like some of these things, they make sense. I don't care if we rename them or what, but should we just put together like that? To me, the next step should be something of a vote. Like here's the bullet points of what we discussed, why they do or don't make sense, and then something like archiving image tools if that's something we want to do. It hadn't had a commit in over a year now, and no activity on the issues per se.
Yeah.
So it's like, to have two of these things, does it make sense? So I don't want to make them like too contingent, too much of a plan, but even as you're sitting here talking, like I'd love to like take an axe to the scope table that shows up on OCI opencontainers.org, and I'd love to
Make it something that people can actually read.
Yeah, I'd love to clarify what the TDC is. Is that just the maintainers from every file? That was never actually clarified.
Yeah.
So like I'm sitting here thinking of like lots of laundry that, you know, would be nice to air out and fix. But
one thing that I would like to be able to do is move the governance from off of the website off into GitHub, because that would mean that everybody could like come in and we could edit it and we could like, you know, patches and things.
yeah, we did that for runc.io, and there's a that now inactive web. If you scroll to the bottom, it's the oldest one, and I don't actually know where the content is, if that is actually any longer the content that is up on the front page. I don't think it is, because it has not been touched in 5 years, and it's Patrick Shazam.
Oh yeah, I remember that. So,
But there was some talk of that. I just don't know where that ended up, Amy.
Okay. I mean,
to have it
honestly,
be
it sounds like
generated.
something that I should do.
But
yeah. So
yeah, that was one of the, I think the only reason that got shot down historically is that it wasn't open for the whole wide world to just sit and make PRs and whatnot on, like typos. Thanks for the notification,
Yeah.
but any updates to that would be the TDC and or TOB. But I agree. I have no idea where it's hosted, and it's kind of like mystical.
That's fine.
Yeah, I
we
mean,
can
the same
take
thing
it.
was true for runc.io, and then that's gone now. But yeah, I think yeah, if we had a GitHub that hosted the website that we could actually send patches to, that'd be nice.
One. I expected it to be at the bottom.
The other thing is that we do have. Sorry.
Go ahead, Alexa.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that I think we have sort of moved some of the governance to a repo, because there's the project template repo, which is possibly the least useful name for a repo, which in theory would be the governance docs for OCI. In practice, oh, and there's also org, so we actually have two. But in theory, this would be where we would collect governance information. Though it's a bit odd historically, because technically runc has like different governance rules, and we've had like, oh, and so does image spec, and there have been arguments between maintainers about that in the past. So not to get too hashed into the history, but yeah, having, if we had one place which included all the governance information, including how the projects work, both for spec and non-spec projects, as well as a massive chopping down of the scope table so that it's understandable. Having all that in one place would be a good thing, I think. Especially if it's on GitHub, then you can send PRs to it, which isn't the case right now for the scope table. I don't even know how I would send a patch to update the scope table.
yeah, there's a issue opened in April 2016 by Chris. There's been confusion on how to directly update the scope table. Yeah. So yeah, I mean clearly, I think we've all noticed that there's, I mean, even trying to come to these proposals and do kind of this digging reveals that there's a lot of cleanup that maybe, you know, should be attacked first. I'm willing to just start opening, simple issues on against TOB repo, if that's the right place. And there's, potentially 9 of us that can do some aspect of it. Maybe that'd be the next good thing to attack, so that we have a clear, once we settle some of those basics of the scope table, the governance, some of those cleanups, out of that hopefully could come a much clearer set of principles, based on our last couple discussions and some of this work, that gives us a much clearer measuring stick, so to speak, to use the term I think Steve was talking about earlier, that it's easier to approach a proposal like ORAS, like Umochi, like something in the future, and say, okay, how's it line up? We can, not that we're going to, not be able to have discussion and some leeway here or there, but almost something that you could score against a set of principles.
I think it would also help teams that if they're targeting something for OCI because they're trying to build something, to know what they should build it in the first place. It's not just an after. It's like, hey, I want to build this thing. If I wanted to go here, here's the things that I should think about. And
yeah,
I mean, I think I missed a little bit when I was transitioning from my phone, but I'm hoping the time we spent on the last couple of calls was more about what is in that scope table, which I think we were talking about, as opposed to whether we approve these 2 projects. It's more about like, hey, now we've got a structure in place. And hopefully we write it down before we even do the vote, because we could actually test what we wrote. The hard part is taking this conversation and get it into words, because I'm sure when you guys started, there was a whole bunch of other faces on this little grid here. And they've all moved on to other projects, and there's some continuity here, but a bunch of us are kind of lost.
Yeah.
Bill, I'm not sure. Hey, sorry, Phil, to interrupt. I'm not sure if it was discussed, but in the beginning of Run C and the runtime spec, we went to just actions to be defined for the Run C, ish API. So the specification is very broad, and we never really created a Run C library or a Run C API. But I think there was intention, certainly at one point in time, to turn Run C into a service API, and then to improve on the runtime specifications. And if we had done that, or if we get to that, when we get to that, then you could see that that Run C isn't really an aberration. It would just be an implementation of the API for testing purposes, right? Or for tertiary implementation. People would probably take the libraries and build them into their container runtimes, as opposed to shelling out to Run C to perform the service action. I think we really, and if we had done that, then I think when you start talking about these client APIs like Emoki and ORAS, that it would make more sense that, okay, well, let's get an API together for that client specification and see if ORAS is going to implement that specification. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I remember all the discussions. Yeah,
there was even a pull request at one point in time to split the Run C into a service API and a client at one point. I think that would be nice to merge with Live Container. I don't know. What do you think, Derek?
Silence.
he might be paying Michael.
We only have one Run C expert on this call. Well, I'm sorry, you've done a lot with Run C as well, but
Alexa,
yeah,
you got a bunch of distribution people here.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say that I think there was definitely a lot of upsides to the proposal to have Run C be an API that's actually specified. I mean, and several of my biggest mistakes in Run C API history are definitely things that would have been fixed if we had sort of nailed down API. I mean, console socket is a most obvious one. But I think this might be a separate issue from eligibility for projects. I think that I don't think that it would require TOB action to say, oh, we want to have an API that then RunC would implement. That's something which, in theory, runtime spec and RunC maintainers could agree on. As an aside, that's actually something that we're missing at the moment is if you want to have two different OCI projects have like a sit together, I mean, obviously you can just organize it normally, but in theory, it would be nice to have like a process of like, okay, let's call a meeting between these two projects so we can hash out disagreements or differences. Because the way historically that this has been worked around is that all the people who were RunC maintainers were basically runtime spec maintainers. So it just turns out that it's effectively the same group of people or a very similar group of people. So, but in the case of the API stuff, there was a bit of a disagreement on the scope of the API and how it should look. I mean, this discussion is ages old, so I might be mischaracterizing it a bit. But I think if we'd had the opportunity to have more sit downs to discuss it, that would have ended differently. And I'm not opposed to the idea now. I think that's something we can do, but I don't think it's relevant for the basis for inclusion for projects.
Yeah. So what do folks think about the idea to lay out some issues in our TOB repo? You know, folks at your volunteer level of volunteerism, take some of this and see how much we can do in the next couple weeks. At least get some things assigned and talked about.
When is the next meeting?
I mean, TOB meetings have never been an official recurring item, except I think maybe in the very, very beginning.
They literally never were recurring.
Yeah. So
these are purely as needed.
Yeah. The expectation is sort of as required, and vote discussion, debate, proposals. That's usually been the trigger. And there haven't been that many of those, so there haven't been many TOB meetings.
Can we track for like mid-May? Is that too far away?
No, I think mid-May is fine. I think Steve's good about keeping me honest usually if I let things lag too long. So, but I definitely would not like us to just say, oh, we'll reconvene mid-May. But I think basically in the next few weeks, actually get some issues in GitHub, have some ownership, have some decisions about next steps, and just try and make progress. I'm not interested in having a call just to have a call. I think we can do a lot of that with GitHub and email. And then,
I can respect that. I was more thinking about it as here is your deadline to be able to get most things on the table for discussion.
Yeah. I think mid-May.
Just so I understand, was the issues thing we're talking about that's how we're going to track how we scope what a good candidate?
Yeah, well, I think yes, in the sense that I think there's several different actionable things that have come up in this call and last call that can be itemized in a single issue and tracked with. We've talked about the fact that there's a disconnect between GitHub and some of the website things. So, but assuming we can fix some of that with Chris and with Amy's help, then it becomes a issue, PR, merge, etc. cycle of fixing some of these things so that we have, to me, the output is a much more clear path that tells us, hey, we've got this rewritten scope table, or I don't even care if it's a table, something that can be readable to someone who knows English and can, process the words and actually understand, oh, this makes sense. Here's how projects fit in the OCI. Here's the buckets. And it'd be cool to me to end up with a document that almost interleaves like, oh, here's github.com/open-container/runc. Here's how it fits in the OCI. Here's its role. Oh, here's image spec. Here's its role. Here's the maintainers. You know, and that can be links into the various GitHub repos. But to me, that's the goal is to take kind of that bucketized thing that we have here at the end of the HackMD and massage that back into the real governance and definition of the OCI. And that may take a series of issues and PRs and time and some actions. And that's what I'm hoping we can do as a group without another meeting, and come out of that with something much more concrete to assess projects with.
So I'm kind of hearing a little bit, there's like the boil the cup, boil the lake, boil the ocean kind of thing. Like, do we want to, if we can get a crisp set of criteria, I think what you're saying is we want to get it into the ocean of the website, but the problem is the website isn't in GitHub at this point for us to easily manage. Do we want to maybe start?
That's okay.
By,
We can start with the GitHub repo and then move things over into the website. Don't look at the website like that. Look at the GitHub piece.
Yeah.
that's what I was trying to figure out is how far.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We're having the same problem in the image. Was it the image spec or the distribution spec that we've been talking about doing some things in it for so long, and it just,
Yep.
And I just, in a priority list of things, can we make achievable results?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing we can do is we can, one thing we can do is we can just have a markdown file in opencontainers.org or something, which we take the existing contents of the website, namely the scope table and everything else, copy it into there, start merging PRs to it, and we can sort out what linking it to the website later. I think it's actually exactly what Amy just mentioned, just suggested, but
Yeah, Steve, I agree that some of this is a longer tail, and I think there are multiple streams of activities that maybe by the end of the year, you know, we've got this beautiful orchestrated thing where governance changes and typos to the website. But I'm not gating having that crisp definition on finishing all those things. But I think VBAT's, you know, brought up earlier, it's any of us that go and start poking at some of our data sources, it's like, oh crap, you know, there's stuff we should really clean up. And I think this would be a good opportunity to at least lay out the items. They're not all going to be done next month. But that way we kind of have a clear path that says, okay, here's our definition, you know, okay, it's not fully, you know, realized as part of the website yet, but we can now kind of take our projects through this filter and see if it makes sense. We want to refine anything and hopefully get some movement on that.
Cool. So just, I'm going to be selfish. There's still some sunlight left. I've been locked up in front of this computer all day. So I'm going to go out for a bike ride. Do we think we can get crisp and wrap up?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to take the action to just go open some of those issues. Vincent, love you. Sound like you had some thoughts.
I've already opened a couple just now, one of which is if I could see access to the documents so we could actually have like a reasonable back and forth in this governance and scope table.
Cool.
Amy, is that something you're going to help look into, of even how we could have a back and forth on that?
Yes.
'Cause I'd love to clarify who the TDC is, and I just pasted some shitty bash in here, but I was just like, is it all the maintainers? And Derek, for God's sake, you got 3 different emails on here, pal.
Wait, does it count as 3 different people?
Do what?
Sorry, if you have different email addresses and different maintainer files, you count as different people.
Oh, I see. All 3, all same GitHub handle, but
We should fix
yeah,
that.
we should handle that.
We should fix that.
Yeah. Yeah, Steve, I think we're good. I'm gonna send an email. I'm not gonna promise tomorrow, but by midweek, and by then the issue should be open, and I'll just kind of make a summary of what I think the steps are, and then we can go from there and see who's available to help with what piece of it. And then I think we can just track it in our hopefully usual open source ways from there. But keep me honest if you don't hear anything from me. Yeah, I definitely would love to move this forward and not not spend much more time kind of circling around the issue. So, all right, thanks.
So is the act time to put a calendar, a meeting, another meeting, maybe at the same time, and sometime in May, and then
Yes.
follow up with the action items?
Yeah, I will. Does anyone have an issue with this time? I mean, if we do it like 5 weeks from now, would be basically mid-May, like May 3rd.
That's okay with me. One thing I wanted to mention, by the way, is that Australia switched daylight savings, so it's now 10. It's not to 10 a.m., not 11 a.m., which I don't mind either way. But I don't know, when does the U.S. switch daylight saving?
We already
Oh man, don't ask these questions. It's still sort of it's too soon.
Yeah,
Later.
we're done. We're done
I think
with
that
all
got canceled.
that. No,
The rest of the year
we're.
got canceled, yeah.
Can we get daylight savings canceled because of coronavirus?
I think that's a good excuse.
Yeah.
I mean, Europe's already done it, so.
Yeah.
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 All right.
All right.
See all y'all online.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
See ya. Happy hacking.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Bill. Bye all.